This is the ESPN Aussie Hoops Hour podcast. Kane, Pittman and Olgun back together after a little bit of turmoil trying to get the podcast off the ground last week. Olgun, I know you mentioned it, and Pete Hooley did a great job stepping in, but you mentioned it. I was in Indy with the Pacers doing media day. We tried hotel Wi-Fi. We tried hotspot, and we just couldn't get it to go. And the sad part about that is that I felt like I was really on the front foot. I was really attacking you for those 30 minutes that never made the air. And a little bit of it was about Adelaide. And you know this. We're going to get to the Adelaide 36ers and their 2-0 weekend at some point in this podcast. Are you prepared for that conversation?
Of course I am. You know what? I felt bad for you because I knew for those who don't know, we did like a bit of a podcast, but yes. I don't know if there's just no Wi-Fi in Indianapolis. I don't know what's going on in that city. But we did so much of it, and it was crackly. I couldn't continue. I felt really bad about it. I know you felt bad about it. I felt bad that you couldn't have your sort of NBL say over the course of the week. So I know you've been chomping at the bit to get on today.
Yeah, I've still got some notes from last week that I want to touch on today's show. We're going to try and rip through a bunch of teams in the big storyline. So Adelaide's going to be a part of that. We're going to have a big Cairns Taipans chat because they were probably the other winners out of the weekend. But I do think a fun place to start this weekend, and I tweeted about it. I'm glad that, sometimes if I'm not watching these games live, I try and go no spoiler mode. And sometimes you just flip up Instagram and there's the final score and you see it. Still watch the games, but you don't have that suspense. I was so glad with this Tassie-Perth game and all the craziness at the end of the game. And Perth fans have a reason to feel annoyed about the way that it ended. Tassie fans, they were watching their team just about throw away the impossible with a minute to go in regulation. Where do you want to start with this one? This was so much fun, and I was very jealous of the crew that was in there, including our man, Leonard Copeland.
So this wasn't a good game. This was a really exciting ending.
Yes.
But I thought basically up until like the 4-minute mark in the fourth quarter, it just wasn't a great game. Even and I think Scott Roth said as much. Like, you guys, I think he said it in the huddle. Like, you guys don't deserve to win this, but like if we're in this now, we might as well go try. But even like as far as his like process, I just thought they were just going like ISO Milton Doyle, and we spoke last week. I spoke last week with Hools about who do you want the ball in the hands of in the clutch, and we mentioned Tyler Harvey because that happened at the time, and then we mentioned Bryce, and I felt bad because we just dismissed Milton Doyle, and that might actually be the answer, and he showed that with that shot over Bryce, with some of the other clutch shots down the stretch. But this was a hectic ending. It seemed like no team wanted to win this game. Tassie almost threw it away at the end of regulation. It was wild. What was like the big takeaway at the end of this one for you?
Well, it was interesting because both teams coming off a loss early in the round. Tassie up in Cairns. Perth just got the doors blown off them by Melbourne United. Now, that was such an anomaly that I'm not too worried, honestly, even at the end of this, that Perth lose both of these games. It's so early in the season. The fact that they lose, I don't think they can get that back if they are who I think that they are. But I was watching this game and I was thinking about Keanu Pinder for where I look at the ceiling of this Perth Wildcats team. So again, I don't care that they lost these games. They're 1-3, but there's plenty of time to figure it out. But I don't know whether I see this team making a grand final if Keanu Pinder isn't a star in this league. And I guess that's my question, and that's what I put down in my notebook. What is Keanu Pinder? Because now he's in his second season with the Perth Wildcats, and no question, when they recruited him, they were getting a guy that they thought could get 18 to 20 points a night, and he would be a guy that would dominate, like we saw in Cairns in NBL 23. He only played 19 games, but he was a guy that was in conversation for MVP, and we just haven't seen that. And his numbers have progressively gone down, but so are the minutes. And this was the thing that concerned me the most. Now, whether or not he needs to be the second guy, we'll wait and see, because Dylan Windler will come back in, and I think he's going to be a star in this team. So maybe that helps Pinder, and he's the third guy, and maybe he doesn't need to be that primetime scorer. But for him to get checked out of this game in regulation with 4:08 to play and pretty much sit out the rest of regulation, he came in for a few possessions here or there in the last 10 seconds. That was bizarre to me. And I don't know whether he wasn't 100%. We know he got another whack in the face there. Was he ill last week? I'm not so sure if there's other things going on. But he has to be better, that he is a guy that can't get taken off the floor in crunch time in a close game like that. That was jarring to me.
Yeah, so when you say, like, what should he be? He is their second highest paid player. He is their marquee. That's what they signed him as, right? He was their highlight signing last offseason, right? And so he's someone who should be giving you more consistent output, right? He shows up every second or third game when it comes to the production you expect from someone on that sort of money. We've seen this over the course of John Riley's tenure as Wildcats head coach. He is not afraid to just take guys out.
No,
he's not afraid to be really tight with the rotations. We saw that against Sydney, where Pinder played 10 minutes. He wasn't sick. There was nothing wrong with him. He just wasn't doing the job, right? They prefer to go small ball with Doolittle at the 5 than have Pinder on the floor. Now, in this game, both coaches was sort of trying to outwit each other, right? We had Scott Roth go small for the majority of the back end of that game with practically Majuk Deng at the 5, no Magne on the floor until the very, very end. So these are teams just trying to outwit each other. But I think I agree with your point. If you're going to be that guy in this league, if you're going to be paid that amount of money, if you're going to be presumably the second option on your team, you can't be someone who gets taken off the floor because of a strategic move, right? You have to be able to stay on the floor when it matters most. And unfortunately for Pinder, John really doesn't think that he can be that guy. But I agree with you that the absence of Windler, I think a lot of people spoke about Ty Webster as him being out, really messing with a lot of what the Wildcats are trying to do, especially with getting Cotton the ball. I think Windler being out is even more important. There's the scoring aspect of it, which helps spread the floor and keeps both Cotton and Pinder effective out there. But also he's got like a connectivity to his game where he's able to be like the glue that holds everyone together on both ends. And I feel like they miss that a lot. He should be back for their next game against Cairns in Cairns. But yeah, without Windler on the floor, it just seems like everyone's sort of doing their own thing. That's including Cotton and that's including Pinder.
So you can look at this in two ways if you're a Wildcats fan, because I imagine that maybe there's some Perth fans that get defensive about this, but then I imagine there's some other fans that are also frustrated and wondering, okay, what does it look like? So if you go back in the season so far, in game 1, he looked absolutely unstoppable. Now, to be fair, you're playing the Phoenix, and I think there's going to be teams that are going to pad their stats against that team. And I don't think they had any answer defensively, particularly for a big man. But he had 29 points in that game, and they win. In the next 3 games, he's had 1 point, 10 points, and 7 points. They lose all 3 of them. And then I go back to the semifinal series last year where they had home court advantage. In game 1, he has 25 points. They win. In total, in game 2 and 3, he has 7 points. He has 0 points in game 3, and they lose on their home floor. So that's why I bring it up, because I think it changes the calculations of where I think the team can get to. I think they're going to be good. I think they'll make the playoffs. Probably a top 4 team, certainly a play-in team. But if Pinder is that dominant guy, I can see him making a grand final. So I think he's the guy that can really elevate this team, even with the inclusion of Windler, which is a big reason why I'm not too fussed that they lost these 2 games. I'm not going to knock the Wildcats, or it doesn't change where I think they can get to. But whether it's playoffs or it's grand final, I think Pinder's a big factor.
Yeah, and I'm very intrigued about this next game, Perth against Cairns. We just saw Melbourne have a lot of issues scoring inside. Yes. It's because of the size and the length of this Cairns Taipans team. It's everyone from Sam Wardenberg in there to AK Gak to Kyron Galloway. Tanner Groves didn't even play in that game. And so if Keanu Pinder is expecting to walk into Cairns back into that building and have an easy reception in there going up against what is maybe the most the deepest, most rounded front court in the league, then I think he may have some issues. If he's not able to get going inside like that, then I don't know if there's going to be the confidence to get the outside game going. You speak about that one game he was good in, that opener against Southeast. He was actually not very good in that first half. He really popped off in the second half, hit a bunch of shots. But yeah, against Cairns is not the team that you want to go up against if you want to get back rolling if you're a big, because we saw what they did to the entire United squad the other day.
Yeah, I agree. And again, we mentioned that at the start. Hopefully Pinder is okay. He did get a knock to the face again and looked a little bit shook up from that. We know he's still wearing a mask. I believe that he feels comfortable wearing it, but clearly that was a pretty nasty injury that he had going back a little while now as well. And at times it doesn't feel like he's had that confidence or aggression. But, John Riley, you already mentioned, he would point to the fact that he was really important on the glass in this game. So he can impact games in other ways. So maybe there would be some pushback from the Wildcats there. But I just think he has to be more of a factor scoring and being aggressive and getting into the paint and opening up everyone else's game on the outside. I mentioned John Riley because we've discussed the Jack Jumpers, and, I've still got faith in them. And it was a very Jack Jumper-y win, I would say, the way they hung in there. And then ultimately, a reason why I do have faith is because I think Magnay is a top-tier big man in the league. We saw him have a big impact again. You can make your case whether you thought he should have been playing or not, but he was out there. And then you look at the two closers. But here is one thing that could be a little bit concerning. And John Riley, from the start of this game, Todd Withers, the replacement player, he's guarding Jordan Crawford. And we saw the Perth Wildcats as a generally big team use size on Jordan Crawford. I've been a little bit surprised that it hasn't happened more over the last 2 years, although you could make the case everyone has size over Crawford. But I do think last year, because McVeigh was there, they had another release valve that they could win games when Crawford wasn't that impactful. And I do wonder now whether they need the more consistency from Crawford and whether that hurts their offense more, particularly with Sean McDonald out of the lineup. So that's just a note I've got down there, the consistency of Crawford and where the teams try and really crowd him and say, well, Doyle will do what he'll do. But if we shut down Crawford, we think we can score enough points to beat the Jackies.
Yeah, that's like the overarching thing that's going to be behind this Jack Jumpers team, which is they are going to be what they are defensively, which we've known that over the past few years, right? There's a Jack Jumper way. There's a identity with what that team does defensively, especially at home. That's why this game was largely gross. But offensively is where they're going to have issues. And I think they know that too, right? They know that right now, again, small sample size, very early, they're the worst offensive team by a significant margin. And I don't see that changing especially because Sean McDonald is out, but also because they didn't really adequately replace Jack McVeigh. Now, I think there's some thinking in that franchise that maybe McVeigh will be available, and if so, there's a lever they can pull there. I don't think McVeigh's going to be available this season. So there is some thinking that they may have to pull a lever at some stage, but at what point does it become too late to implement like a new offensive player or a new scheme or anything like that? But the defense will carry them. The defense is the thing that keeps their floor relatively high. The lack of offense, the lack of just general firepower is the thing that I think really caps their ceiling and makes me think that they're not really a title contender this season. They're going to be in around the mix just because of what they are, but they need that extra lift if they're going to be anywhere, if they're going to be like a legitimate top four contender.
Yeah, glad you mentioned Jack McVeigh. I had a couple of people on social media ask that question, or perhaps to your point, as fans of the Ants, they're expecting that Jack McVeigh will be back. So that's a good point that you make there. And if you want to get involved in the show, you can do it either on Twitter or hit us up on Instagram, or certainly on the YouTube page where the full show is on. Get in the comments there. We always look at them and we see what you guys are saying and your thoughts on the show. So get involved, ESPN Aussie Hoops Hour podcast there. It's time now for PointsBet Built Different. And you mentioned the Cairns Taipans, and this was a player that we have been looking forward to seeing play from the end of last season, where there was some promise there. There was big expectations in the offseason that Taran Armstrong could be a star for the Taipans, and the Snakes go 2-0 with Armstrong back in the lineup. Over those games, he scored 34 points. He was plus 39, or the Taipans were plus 39 with Armstrong on the floor. He was incredibly impactful. And in that game against Tassie, he completely closed them out down the stretch with scoring, not just his facilitation.
He was on a 20-minute restriction because of a calf injury he was returning from. He played almost 30 minutes in that game, hit some clutch buckets at the end. He had Will Magnay on an island, and that's not an island that anyone really wants to be on, but that was something that Taran Armstrong relished. He went right at him, scored 2 buckets around him. He had 20 points in that first game, super efficient in both games. The shot is looking real. The facilitation is obviously there. His body looks better. We're seeing a leap from Taran Armstrong. It's going to make this Taipans team better. It's going to bode well for the remainder of Taran Armstrong's career. And at 22 years old, Adam Ford decided to build this Taipans team around Taran Armstrong. And it's because of what we're seeing right now. This is what Adam Ford envisioned when he realized, I'm going to build this team around Taran Armstrong. And it's very, very cool to see.
Yeah, so much optimism around exactly that, giving Taran Armstrong the keys in the offseason. And maybe there was some question marks, but if you're a fan of Aussie hoops, maybe not just the Cairns Taipans, you should tune in to watch Taran Armstrong play. It's highly entertaining. And maybe, as Andrew Gay said on the broadcast, a future boomer. So Taran Armstrong, that's PointsBet Built Different.
What are you really gambling with? For free and confidential support, call the number on the screen or visit the website.
I mentioned Andrew Gay's describing Taran Armstrong as a future boomer. Andrew Gaze is going to be on Nothing But Net Aussie Hoops this Thursday night on ESPN. Make sure you catch it. They play it a few times on ESPN, so check your local times there for when that show will be on. Olgun, you'll be there. Ryan Brockhoff is going to be in studio as well. Leonard Copeland is going to be on the show. So we're going to have a lot of fun. If you haven't caught the show yet, again, get involved in that. Ryan's going to do some breakdowns of the Adelaide 36ers, so it's going to be a lot of fun there. And I'm going to ask Gazy about Taran Armstrong and the Boomers' future, because I thought it was an interesting point to say publicly on the broadcast, and we're all fascinated with what the Boomers look like moving forward. But the Cairns Taipans, you kind of lent into this, and they beat Tassie earlier on in the round. The win against Melbourne was really impressive, and certainly watching the game, it felt like this was an up-and-down game. It felt like it was transition. It didn't feel like there was much defense, just if you look purely at the score. But your point earlier, I completely agree. I had that in my notes. This was a really impressive defensive performance by the Taipans. And don't get caught up in the fact that they're going to play up-tempo and take early shot clock shots. If you just look at their defensive rating for this game, it was a 102.4 in this win over Melbourne United. So yes, this team scored some points against them, particularly in the first half, but they were able to shut down the rim. And this was an excellent defensive performance. There was just more possessions in the game, which made it feel like those numbers were inflated. But the defense for me was the thing that stood out.
Yeah, and I think there hasn't been enough talk about the personnel on this team. And I think that starts with Taran Armstrong. I think people think because Taran Armstrong was a bit skinnier last year and he is just like a finesse point guard, right? Because he's so skilled, I think people dismiss the fact that he's actually quite a good defender, especially on the ball. He's added some size as well. So you have that as one of your point of attack defenders. Rob Edwards, everyone's spoken about it. He is a thick gentleman,
Beast.
Right? He is a strong guy. Pedro Bradshaw is also someone who I think is known as a solid point of attack defender, even as like a connective defender. He's there. And then Sam Wardenberg, underrated as a defender. Tanner Groves is that grit and grind sort of guy. And then you have the athleticism and the timing of Akolda Gak and Kyron Galloway. Even Jonah Antonio, I think, has taken a leap defensively. So the personnel on this team, I think he's there to be a good defensive team under Adam Ford, who I think has shown that his teams can excel on the defensive end. And again, if this team can be that defensively, but also have the firepower that it does on the other end, where it's Taran Armstrong leading the way, and you generally have trust in him to run your offense. You have Rob Edwards, who I think is one of the best scorers in the NBL, just someone who can go create his own shot, work off Taran Armstrong, and then Bradshaw is a connector offensively. And if Sam Wardenberg is hitting shots, and if Kyron Galloway is shooting the way that he's shooting the ball, all the pieces are there. And I have a story on ESPN.com.au on how this team came together, how Adam Ford built it around Taran Armstrong. And everyone mentioned the balance. And that's something that I think is so noticeable early on. The balance is just there, right? The spacing is there. No one's getting in each other's way. Everyone knows their roles. It's working out really well. This is, again, what Adam Ford envisioned when he built the team.
So to some of those points, and I'm looking forward to reading that story as well, but this is what Adam Ford has done before. And I remember having these conversations with you going back to NBL 23, so 2 seasons earlier, when we looked at this Cairns Taipans team. And I think they fool people, because I remember telling you when everyone was describing that 23 Cairns Taipans team, so obviously Tajir McCall was there, Keanu Pinder was there, and then Pinder got injured. But the one thing that didn't change was the fact that this was a top defense. So they were the number 2 ranked defense in the league. New Zealand was the only team better than them, and Sydney was number 3. Sydney and New Zealand made the grand final series. So when you were looking at the Snakes, again, everyone's like, oh man, they're an explosive offense. Oh, they shoot threes. Geez, they play fast tempo. No, they were defending teams, and then they were taking the shots that they were given on the other end. And if they can force turnovers like they were able to on the weekend, they're going to get good looks. And they've got young athletic players that Adam Ford has picked a team that he believes can play defense. And I think that the Snakes are going to continue to fool people, but don't be fooled. This team is a good defensive team, and it wouldn't surprise me by the end of the year, as they come together with a whole bunch of new players, if they end up a top 4 defense in the league. And they're pretty entertaining to watch. The question I've got for you, a man that you had in your NBL Supercoach team, Groves, did not play on Sunday against Melbourne United. And it might be matchup dependent, but we've discussed a few times, there aren't really dominant 7-footers, big men that are taking over the NBL right now. And after not playing much in game 1, Kyron Galloway has been a 20-minute per game player. He was a lot of the times the guy that was meeting Jack White at the rim on Sunday, and Jack White was incredibly frustrated. If you're watching this game on the broadcast, he was missing shots at the rim he normally would, but I think a lot of it was great defense. And Galloway has become incredibly important for this team defensively, and then really as a knockdown shooter. So I had him down. He had 30 points over the weekend across these 2 games, and I expect the shooting, perhaps 30 points on 17 shots. That efficiency isn't going to hang around. But defensively, I think he allows this team to do a whole bunch of things. So I am curious. We haven't seen a lot of Groves, so maybe this is me, what I know or what I've seen, a little bit of Galloway in the past. But we've been waiting for him to be a guy that takes the next step. And we almost shouldn't be surprised that he goes to Cairns in this team under Adam Ford where he can thrive. So I'm excited to see what he brings to the table because he was kind of the Galloway that got pushed to the side. It was all about Jalen, but now we're seeing Kyron having a great chance at getting big minutes.
So firstly, I removed Tanner Groves from my Supercoach team. And
apologies. Who'd you put in? Kendric Davis? We're going to get to the 36ers. Did you put him in?
Of course I did.
Yes.
Of course I did. And
Good
I won this week as my first win of the year. But look, Tanner Groves he's not like at the level where like you have to start him.
No.
Right? He's a very solid player. But I think Adam Ford is willing to be quite malleable with the rotation. Right? I also do think that what Tanner Groves brings from like a grit standpoint defensively, he is a pop threat. I think he brings a ton of energy. I still think it's worth starting him in the same way that I think Sydney will remain starting Kelly Leopepe just because of the sort of intangibles he brings. Because then the other side of that is would it take away from Kyron Galloway's rhythm to an extent to start him in a game as opposed to bringing him off the bench initially as sort of as a weapon, as a microwave, as someone who shoot a bunch of threes, even if they're contested. And then maybe there's not as much pressure on him to give you a ton of output from the get-go. I like the idea of continuing to bring him off the bench. I get he started against Melbourne. But I think 40 will be malleable with this. Even someone like AK Gak, I don't know if there's going to be a matchup that will require AK Gak to start games, but he does bring a different look with his athleticism and as a lob threat as well. Like he had 14 and 8 in that game against Melbourne. Like he was outstanding in that game, and especially defensively as well. We speak about Kyron Galloway and Sam Wardenberg defensively in that game, but even AK Gak as a rim protector, someone who's going to deter shots, he was great as well, which is why we talk about, I look at it, it's kind of frustrating. I look at like Southeast Melbourne, who have, one functional big man. I look at this team, they've got 4 of them, and 40's just swimming in this talent, and a lot of it is because he put faith in these guys. He put trust in it, in AK Gak and Kyron Galloway. It's what 40 has done quite well. He empowers guys, and he's getting the fruits from it right now.
Yeah, we've discussed it. If you're a young player coming out of college, and there are other options, you can play for different teams, but there are some teams that the opportunities might not be there as much as they will, where Adam Ford says, hey, you earn minutes, I'm going to give you 20 minutes over a veteran. I don't really care. We've seen that with Galloway. And just the positional stuff, why I think that, I know he doesn't have to start. He can still get his 20 minutes a night. It's not the be-all or end-all. But when you do look at guys like White, Xavier Cooks, even Pinder this week, he can play bigger than his size, but he's a big guy. So he can guard those athletic 4-5s, which are really the dominant position. We saw him guard Montrezl Harrell a little bit as well, going back a couple of weeks ago or the previous round. So that's maybe why. That position at the mobile 4-5 seems to be where the better teams have their better players. So I'm curious to see what happens there with Kyron Galloway. But the Cairns Taipans have been a pretty fun team to watch for sure. Should we get to Adelaide? Now, the Adelaide 36ers did go 2-0 across the weekend. They beat the Phoenix, so they should, at home. So they just took care of business there. But then the win against Illawarra, this was another really entertaining game. And it's funny you mentioned about the closers and who's going to hit the big shot. Well, Tyler Harvey did it again. But it just wasn't enough in this game, and the 36ers were able to close this out. I've got some thoughts, but get us started where you want to lean into with the 36ers, because overall, it was an impressive win. And actually, my first question to you, as you're watching this game unfold against Illawarra and Kendric Davis is just scoring and scoring, do you turn the Twitter notifications off? Are you thinking, oh, man, this is not the immediate response I needed? What's going through your head? Because I think that's what people want to know, actually.
All right, where do I start with it? So here's what frustrated me, firstly, and then we'll go on to the performances, right?
Okay.
If you consume our content, the content that we write for ESPN, that we do on broadcast and digital,
yes,
you will have seen a feature article of and touching on the 36ers, the split from Scott Ninnis, how they're leaning into Mike Wells. And there was a significant portion of that story that touched on Kendric Davis, the type of player he is, how he might translate to the NBL. And there were the questions that I asked were the same questions that his head coach asked, which was this is a G League scoring guard. How will he be in the NBL where possessions matter more? There are less possessions. It is more physical. There's more pressure on you. The stakes are higher. How will he compete here? So these are legitimate questions that his head coach was asking, right? Now, I understand what the NBL's media arm has to do, right? They got a singular line, and Kendric Davis responded to it, right? So I understand getting it. I also understand the NBL has to do their thing, right? They need to get their engagement, and it works. They drove engagement. They drove traffic to their website. They did their job, right? But it just painted this picture, this weird binary of either Kendric Davis is good or bad, as opposed to having a nuanced discussion, a nuanced conversation, which is what I think that we have on our channels here and in that story of you can look at a player, and I've said ad nauseum that this is a supremely talented offensive player, and that's what we've seen. But there are still question marks. If you want legitimate basketball discussion, those are legitimate questions that we're going to be asking, right? And I just hope everyone in the NBL ecosystem, all the fans out there, I hope they actually do want nuanced discussion and not just the clickbait stuff. Because it seems right now that as much as they may say, "Oh, we don't want to hear about Dame Lowry's column every week, and we don't want to see this clickbait stuff," but you keep engaging with it, right? So either you want the nuanced basketball discussion, if so, then engage in good faith, or you don't want it, and if so, then just go and consume that stuff and leave us alone, I guess, right? But we're here to have nuanced discussions about this stuff. Legitimate basketball people are asking this question about Kendric Davis. He went out and he showed exactly what he is. He's a supremely talented offensive player. But we can also look at this Adelaide 36ers team, see that they went 2-0, see that they had a win over Southeast, right? Which you can say that's the win that they should get. And then the win over Illawarra in Wollongong was extremely impressive, right? Going into that building and beating them was great. The Adelaide 36ers are still the worst defensive team in the league. Now, that's not hating on them, right? This isn't binary. We're allowed to say that they're good at this thing, but there's this thing they need to work on. Mike Wells is not going to tell you that we are this great defensive team. He will tell you that we're a bad defensive team. So we're allowed to say that this was a great week for the 36ers. We can say that. And don't quote me otherwise, right? This was a tremendous week. I think there was growth as well. Finding Isaac Humphries, Kendric Davis finding his spots better. But there's still things they need to work on because they're still the worst defensive team. They put together 2 below-average defensive performances, and we can have 2 thoughts at once. We can engage in this sort of discussion. I just hope that everyone out there doesn't get caught up in the clickbait again.
I am glad I just cleared the decks before we started this Adelaide conversation and said, Olgun, Ulich, go get something off your chest because, my man, you didn't get a chance to do it last week because the podcast never went to air. I'm not sure if you and Hooley got into it, but now you've just had 2 weeks. It's been built up, and Davis was outstanding in the win over Illawarra, 32 points. You acknowledge that. I respect that. And just like I said last week on Nothing But Net Aussie Hoops, 2 rounds, a little too early to have any definitive answer. I would say 3 rounds is a little too early to have any definitive answer. But what I will be doing, and I suggest everyone listening to the podcast does, is tune in at 7:30 p.m. this Friday night for the 36ers and the Sydney Kings. And then tune in on Sunday at 4:30 p.m. for the Adelaide 36ers and Melbourne United. It's a big weekend for Adelaide, and I think we'll learn a little bit about them. I think very well. That's a strong rebuttal, by the way. That's some of your strongest stuff that I've heard. So,
and I didn't want to do it on Twitter, right? Because that's where this began, right? That it began with the NBL creating this narrative of Kendric Davis is good or bad, when that's not how we talk about basketball, right? We have nuanced discussions about this stuff. Things aren't binary, and we can have these discussions.
Yep. No. Well said. I'm still in the camp that, personally, for our back and forth banter, I wasn't upset when I saw that Kendric Davis had 32 points. I said, this is going to be excellent, and I hope my man is ready to deliver some sort of rebuttal, and you did that very strongly. So I'm impressed with your work here. Some of the notes that I've got with the Adelaide 36ers, and I think what we saw, another change that we saw in these 2 wins, was just playing more Montrezl Harrell. Now, I know that sounds pretty simple, and he was coming back off an ACL, and I don't know whether there's any restrictions there. I also don't know whether part of this is Mike Wells understanding that most likely he's only going to be around for a short period of time. So in the first 2 games of the season, how heavily do you lean into this? Or do you understand that, hey, I need to get Isaac Humphries going. I need to get DJ and Kendric Davis and all the other players in the rotation. I know there's been some positivity that maybe Montrez would stay around, but I would imagine he's playing pretty good basketball, and there would be a backup spot for him somewhere in the NBA. That would be my imagination there. But if you go back to the loss against Cairns last week, Montrez scored 20 points in 21 minutes. And just the plus minus, they were dominant when he was on the floor. If they just played him another 8 minutes, they would have won that game. So this week, you have a close game against Illawarra. He plays 28 minutes. He plays 28 minutes against the Phoenix, and they win both of these games. So there were adjustments. Humphries was a lot better. I actually think Montrezl Harrell being on the floor with Isaac Humphries, I had questions about spacing, but actually just with so much attention he gets, Humphries was getting layups. These were great looks. That's why he was so efficient on the weekend. So I think they just played a few more games together. They've had a bit more time to figure it out. And maybe Mike Wells was just like, hey, I just need to play this guy more. He's our best player. It was more than that, and there was more that went into it, but that was pretty simple.
Yeah, so two things. The first is we do have to acknowledge that Southeast Melbourne Phoenix, Illawarra Hawks, so far they don't look like the greatest defensive teams, right? So this was a good opportunity for Adelaide to continue to find their offensive flow. Now, Adelaide is shooting the ball at a really high clip right now over the season. And so we assume that will revert to the mean, and we'll see what happens then, especially if their defense remains at this level, which it's not a great level for it to be at. But I think I'm curious at how sustainable Montrezl Harrell and Isaac Humphries is as a starting lineup. I know they'll then stagger them and things like that. But Kendric Davis, I think he did a better job this round than he did last round of being able to find guys, especially finding Isaac Humphries. And I think it was because of Kendric Davis's penetration. He'd get 2 feet in the paint, or he would draw a defense. And then Isaac Humphries, I think, did a good job of cutting off the ball, those little slips to the rim, rolls down the lane. I thought he did a good job of that, and I thought Kendric did a really good job of finding him. So that was something that I don't think we saw enough of in the first round, on the first few rounds of the NBL season, and he did it really well this time round. A lot of Kendrick's assists in those first 2 rounds, I don't think were to Isaac Humphries, because I think they're still figuring out how to play alongside each other. They took some strides in this game. And then what I think is when that's clicking, and when Kendric Davis and Montrezl Harrell are clicking as a duo, that's opening up Dejan Vasiljevic. And it's no surprise that DJ right now is playing the most efficient basketball that I think he's ever played, because I think the shots are a lot cleaner. I think he's knowing where his shots are coming from a little bit better. The offense of this team is clicking really, really nicely. And I think it's everyone slowly finding their role within it. And again, as much as we talk about Kendric Davis as someone who really kicked off this week, right? And then Montrezl Harrell has been really fun to watch, at least on the offensive end. Dejan Vasiljevic is sort of getting all the fruits of everyone's success, and to the point where we're going to start talking about him as a potential All-NBL level guy if he keeps shooting at this sort of clip, because it's high production, it's high efficiency. And so he's someone who is really making the most of this offense, really clicking, and he's being super, super efficient.
So one thing on Isaac Humphries, because I went back and watched the first 2 games pretty closely, and then obviously watched on this weekend. And I think it's been a trend for a while with him, where you hear it on the broadcast that they need to reward him. They need to get him going. They need to get him the ball. But I think part of it is Isaac Humphries, to me, looks like a confidence player as well. And if things don't go well to start the game, or he gets in foul trouble, or he misses a shot, it seems like it really impacts him. And I thought in this game, because DJ Vasiljevic, I think is actually, we've seen it last year, I think he's actually underrated. Everyone looks at him as a scorer, but he's a willing passer. Yes, he'll take some tough shots, but he's a willing passer, and he's always been a guy that's looked for Isaac. And there was a moment in the game that Adelaide lost in the last round where Davis did get in the paint, and he did find Isaac Humphries, and Humphries kind of just stood there, and they almost got in an argument on the floor because Humphries just didn't shoot the ball, and it was a bunny, and he should have taken that shot. So I think they took steps, and it might be just chemistry, and there's probably a part of them getting used to playing alongside each other. But I also think a part of it is Isaac Humphries just being confident and being aggressive and looking to score and not being passive and not taking that contact and not picking up early fouls and getting himself in foul trouble. So I think it goes both ways. And sometimes I think too often the conversation is just like, well, it's not Isaac Humphries' fault. It's everyone else. Get him the ball. But I think when he's aggressive, you see 2 different players.
Yeah, but I also think it's finding him in the correct spots, right? Like I don't like a token post up. You can tell the amount of times where you just see like, oh, it's now is time that we must get Isaac the ball. They throw the ball inside and no one moves, right? Because it's like, all right, Isaac's got his touch. Great. Like, he's happy now. No, like, there are ways to find him on rolls, which I think is where he's the most effective. Like, there are ways to involve him in the offense. That's not in a tokenistic way. That's not in a patronizing way. That's in a way that is going to obviously help everybody. And I think they did take strides in doing that over the past week than they did before that. Real quick on Montrez. I know you said that he might not be around for much longer. From everything I'm hearing, there's a good chance that he is. Yeah. There are already, I've got to confirm this more today, but I'm hearing that there's already some chit chat about potentially keeping him on for the remainder of the season. Yeah,
I mentioned that, and it might have been your notes there, but I know there was some positivity around that, and they actually had growing belief that they could keep him there. And maybe, I would be curious just to know whether earlier in the season that was part of it. Hey, we've got this really good player, but we know we've got these guys for the season, or it was just the knee stuff, or how it builds. But I think it puts them in an interesting situation. We already talk about a team that's had so much turnover, no continuity, a new coach just before the start of the season, and they've just had a lot of challenges. That's why I didn't think last week I thought it was too early to go over the top. I'm not saying that they've figured it out because they've got two really difficult games, but I think they project as a team that will be better in January than they are now, more so than some of those teams that we think we already know what they look like. Hey, last team I know you wanted to mention quickly, we've discussed them a little bit, the Phoenix. What have you got there? Right now, it was interesting to me in the preseason where there was some suggestions that they would have the best offense in the league and their offense would be so good that it didn't matter if their defense wasn't great because they just outscore teams. That was a little odd to me because that goes against everything we've ever seen. And they had a bunch of guys that had never played together. They've got some individually talented players, but it's an odd fit right now, and it's a really tough watch for this Phoenix team.
I get the thinking, and I had the thinking as well of a team that has Derek Walton Jr. and Geordie Hunter, the potential like pick and roll opportunities there is the crux of what they do. And then Nathan Sobey is a solid scorer in the NBL. He's low efficiency, but he's high output. Matt Hurt is a talented basketball player. Joe Wieskamp can stretch the floor, and he came in as a talented guy as well. So I understand the hope that this would be a great offensive team. Unfortunately, they just haven't clicked. And unfortunately, it's because of a lot of the things that we all forecast, I think, which was Walton and Sobey playing alongside each other. I don't think that's worked so far. And then what happens when Geordie Hunter's not on the floor? And even when he is on the floor, I asked him about this after their game in Perth at Hoops Fest, where it was he has acknowledged that there is a balance he has to have between trying to play really solid straight up defense as the anchor of what they do as the 7-footer, but also as having to sort of contain himself and restrain himself so he doesn't foul out. Because I don't think Matt Hurt at the 5 is effective defensively in any way, and I don't think there are any plans to play Majuk any meaningful minutes. So there are no backup 5 options on this team. So when Geordie Hunter's not on the floor, this team drops significantly defensively. So I think a change has to be made at some point. I don't know if it'll happen before this next game against the Brisbane Bullets, which is the most fascinating game for the weirdest reasons. It is the Phoenix 0-4 and the Bullets are 0-3 going to this game. But there are issues on both ends for this Phoenix team, and there is pressure on Mike Kelly. They are looking at his role relatively closely. He's on the last year of that 2-year deal that he signed before last season. So there's some consternation within this Phoenix camp, and they've just entered this weird 9-day break between their last game and their next game, which is it felt like a fever break. And every team will tell you that you want to win before you go into the fever break, just so you have good vibes around the team. Now, I'm hopeful that the vibes are still high, but there is some there's obvious anxiety within that group right now.
Yeah, let's dive into them a little bit more next week. And the Bullets, a team we haven't discussed a lot. To be fair, there hasn't been a lot to talk about. It hasn't been great for either of those teams. It is a fascinating matchup. New Zealand, of course, they're overseas right now. In fact, as we record this, they're about to tip off in their second NBA game. And as I commented on Instagram, Olgun, they got a 2-0 record, undefeated, and they said, we're leaving. We're leaving for a few weeks, so we're just going to be sitting on top of the ladder looking beautiful.
Stop the count, Kane.
Exactly right. So the Breakers undefeated over in the US, playing some games there, 3 games on their slate. This is game number 2, so keep track of that there. And Taco 4, we'll see what happens there with the Breakers. And Melbourne United, we actually haven't discussed a lot as well. Maybe next week is the time to dive into them. I think that's it for today. We are going to dive into some of these topics a little bit more. Adelaide 36 is more, for sure, breakdown version with Ryan Brockhoff on Nothing But Net Aussie Hoops. Make sure you check that out. Olgun will have all the latest news for you there as well. It's going to be a fun show. Andrew Gaze, Leonard Copeland there as well. Olgs, good stuff by you. And, I'm still not 100% sure whether last week you were just pretending you couldn't hear me because you were under heavy fire, but you've had a week to compose yourself and bring that strong rebuttal to the table. I'm not sure whether everyone will love it, but that's not the point. I thought it was a strong performance.
I just wanted to see Pete Hooley last week, to be honest. So I just pretended I couldn't hear you, did a little show with him, got to see my friend. That was fun.
I saw on YouTube, actually, someone said, this show's a little weird without Pittman. And I chose to take that as a positive, but I don't know whether this listener meant it's weird in a better way. So if that was the case, I'm sorry that I'm back, but this is the way it's going to be for the rest of the season, for the most case, unless there's some other odd issues there. But we'll do our best every single Tuesday to bring you the ESPN Aussie Hoops Hour podcast. He's Olgun and Kane. I'm Kane Pittman. Enjoy the hoops this round.